Now that we've all learned a little something from our legal experts, let's shift to the real-world impacts. There are 3 ways to avoid potential pitfalls. They include financial independence, political engagement, and documentation and legal preparedness. Let's tackle financial independence first. Michealle, you recommend that organizations limit federal funding to a sustainable percentage of their budget. What's realistic target, and how do organizations get there?
So there's really no magic number that will work for every organization. I would generally recommend that nonprofits limit federal funding, or really any single source of funding, to no more than 50% of their total budget. And what would be better, honestly, is a 30 to 40%, because that would just be much safer. The goal is to ensure that while losing federal funding would force difficult decisions and program cuts, if you are at or below that 50%, it wouldn't trigger an immediate organizational collapse. But getting there is certainly a challenge, especially for organizations that are currently, 70% or more federally funded. We work with organizations that are completely federally funded. So this transition, it needs to be both realistic and strategic. And so what I would recommend is a multi-year diversification plan that focuses on building multiple revenue streams at the same time, rather than trying to replace federal funding dollar for dollar. So this might mean starting with small scale fee-for-service programs, developing corporate partnerships, or launching individual donor programs. The key is really about building organizational capacity for fundraising and revenue generation that many nonprofits honestly have never had to develop, because they've relied so heavily on federal grants. It also means that organizations will need to evaluate all of the services and support they provide and determine which ones are core to their mission, while others are ended, reduced, or put on hold. And this will be really hard for nonprofit leaders, but it's a critical step to ongoing operations. And then there's also an opportunity for nonprofits to seek and implement partnerships or initiatives with similarly focused nonprofits that share, a mission or populations or objectives, and that will allow them to not only share the workload, but to also reduce competition for limited funding, whether a federal source, a state source, or a private source.
So what does the actual transition process look like? Let's say I'm a head of an organization that has 70% or more federal funding. What does the actual day-to-day process look like?
So the transition process has really become urgent for many organizations, especially since we have already seen these federal funding cuts take effect. For organizations that are 70% federally funded, this isn't just planning for potential changes anymore. It's crisis management and strategic repositioning that needs to happen at the same time. And so I would say the first step has to be a complete financial vulnerability assessment, and I mean complete. You need to understand not just your current federal funding, but which programs have already been cut, which are under immediate threat, and what the political trajectory looks like for your remaining funding sources. If you haven't started already, year 1 is about damage control and foundation building. And so that needs to happen immediately, if not already. And so this means ensuring ironclad compliance with whatever federal grants you still have, because you cannot afford to lose funding due to administrative issues. At the same time, you need to be building or enhancing basic fundraising infrastructure. So donor databases, grant writing capacity, relationships with individual donors and local funders who understand your mission. Then years 2 and 3 become about aggressive diversification, but the timeline may be much shorter than we'd like. And so it's better to run sustainable programs at 50 or 60% of your current size than try to maintain current operations and risk complete organizational collapse when more federal funding disappears. So organizations that survive this transition will be the ones that started planning yesterday, not tomorrow, because unlike previous budget cycles where you could see cuts coming kind of years out, some of these funding losses have already happened, and more could come through the additional rescission packages that the administration has already signaled it's planning.
So, Devon, from a legal perspective, why is financial diversification now more critical than before all of the court decisions we talked about before?
So financial diversification is even more critical for nonprofit organizations. I think based on, what Michealle has just said, you can't rely on funding during a lawsuit. And after a successful lawsuit, if you're not the plaintiff, you can't rely on the injunction benefiting you. So after CASA, they've lost their universal legal shield. And after the NIH ruling, they can't rely on timely recovery, even if they have a strong case. If the case is successful, since it's going through two different courts, it's going to be a longer process if they do get a successful ruling.
So now I'd like to talk about advocacy and political engagement. I know from previous positions in my life, working in nonprofits, many are concerned about the legality of advocacy and lobbying. So, Devon, what does effective legislative advocacy look like for nonprofits within those IRS limits?
So, advocacy is a very broad term. It's important to understand the difference between advocacy and lobbying, and if you don't know, to double check. If something is questionable, double check. Advocacy is more or spreading awareness for a mission that the company has. They can't endorse a political figure, and it has to be nonpartisan. Where lobbying is advocating for a specific piece of legislation. And nonprofits can do a little bit of lobbying. It still has to be nonpartisan, but there's a very fine line, and sometimes I think it gets a little blurry. So it's important for these nonprofits to know what advocacy is, what lobbying is, where the line is. And so for effective advocacy, it involves strategic planning, building a coalition, getting support within the legal limits. And to do this, you want to build a clear, compelling narrative, maybe personal stories, establishing yourself, your nonprofit, as a resource for policymakers, providing them with well-researched information, and building a relationship with those policymakers, as well as leveraging traditional and social media to draw attention to the cause that you are supporting or advocating for.
So, Michealle, as an alumni of Washington, D.C., as an advocate and congressional staffer, how does an organization go about building relationships with their congressional delegation, especially if they've never done it before?
Mm-hmm. So I think it's really important for nonprofits to understand that building congressional relationships requires understanding that advocacy is fundamentally about relationship building and not just issue education, as Devon alluded to. Too many nonprofits only contact their representatives when they need something, which is exactly backwards. The most effective organizations invest in these relationships when they don't need anything. so they have credibility and access when a crisis arises. So what I encourage nonprofit organizations to do is start with their local representatives, their House members and senators from their state. Attend town halls, invite them to visit your programs, provide regular updates on federal funding impacts, on how federal funding impacts your community. Don't make every interaction about money. Share success stories, introduce them to the constituents you serve, and position your organization as a reliable source of information about local needs. When I worked for different congressional members, when things were coming to me, I needed to understand what their impact were locally. And so whether I was working for a U.S. senator or a congressional member, I would call organizations in the state or in the district and say, hey, what do you think about this? But that's because they had taken the time to establish themselves as a trusted and reliable source. And that really is important for nonprofit organizations to understand, is that congressional staff relationships are also exceptionally important, because it's the staff that do a lot of the work on the issues and the legislation, and they brief the members. The staff is a trusted and reliable resource of the member of Congress, and they expect that their staffers are doing the research, having the conversations, and bringing the vetted and reliable information. So really invest time, not just in the congressional member, but also in building those relationships with staff. Educate them about your work, and become that truly trusted resource that they can call whenever they need information in your issue area.
As a former congressional staffer myself, I wholeheartedly agree. And I've also known many organizations, when they can't get that meeting with their congressman or senator, they give up.
Yeah,
When you should be saying, who's covering my particular area? Which staffer? Go into them, because most of the time the staffer will make time for you sooner or later.
Absolutely.
So speaking of nonprofits, now we've got them advocating. Now we need to worry about monitoring what's going on. So what should nonprofits be looking for, especially around the Rescissions Act that has terminated already appropriated funding? What should they be looking out for?
So organizations really need like an early warning system that goes beyond that traditional policy monitoring. The Rescissions Act moved incredibly quickly once it was introduced, giving organizations very little time to mobilize opposition. Nonprofits need to be tracking not just introduced legislation, but also budget reconciliation discussions, appropriations negotiations, and even OMB communications that might signal future rescission proposals that could be coming from the administration. So I would recommend that organizations subscribe to multiple policy monitoring services, join coalitions that share intelligence, develop relationships with appropriations committee staff who can provide early warnings about those potential cuts, and really monitoring everything that is happening so that the organization is prepared to respond quickly. So this means having that advocacy infrastructure in place before you need it. Update contact lists for congressional offices. Who is the House member? Who is their staff for health? Who is their staff for housing? Who is, all of that. You have templated materials that can be quickly customized for specific threats, and use coalitions so that those partnerships can amplify your voice. Organizations need to be prepared for the political reality that defending already appropriated funding requires different messaging than advocating for new funding. So you're not asking for something new, you're asking your congressional member, whether in the House or the Senate or both, to honor the commitments they've already made.
Well, last but not least, let's talk about documentation and legal preparedness. Michealle, why is documenting the impact of these cuts so crucial, and what should organizations be tracking specifically?
So in this new environment, impact documentation isn't just a good practice, it's really essential for organizational survival. So when funding decisions are being made based on ideological criteria rather than programmatic effectiveness, organizations need overwhelming evidence of their value to counteract that political targeting. Organizations should track both quantitative and qualitative impacts, but they need to think strategically about what resonates with different audiences. So numbers matter for budget justifications. How many people served, what outcomes were achieved, what problems were solved. But stories matter for political communications, individual testimonials about how programs changed lives, community leaders explaining why services are essential, local business leaders describing economic impacts. Organizations also need to document the ripple effects of their work that might not be immediately obvious. So, for example, a health clinic doesn't just provide medical care, it also supports local employment, reduces emergency room costs, and strengthens community economic development. A research program doesn't just generate academic papers, it also trains graduate students, attracts investment, and positions communities as innovation hubs. So the goal is to create a comprehensive case for your organization's value that transcends partisan political considerations. When funding decisions are being made rapidly and with limited input, having this documentation immediately available can mean the difference between surviving cuts and being eliminated.
We talked about organizations being prepared to participate in our federal judicial system. Devon, when does it make sense for an organization to consider joining a class action lawsuit versus going it alone? And how does that organization join such a lawsuit?
So typically, organizations have joined class actions when individual litigation is economically impractical. So there's been widespread harm, but the harm suffered is relatively small. However, after CASA, organizations will have to join lawsuits to secure the protection that is no longer guaranteed by universal injunctions. The process of joining a class action depends on whether it's an opt-out or opt-in, or if you're going to start your own class action. But an opt-out lawsuit means eligible organizations are automatically included once a class is certified. They receive a notice and they have to explicitly choose to opt out by a certain deadline. Opting in is an organization must actively join by filling out and submitting a claim form by a certain deadline.
What are the key factors an organization should consider before pursuing any kind of litigation?
So before deciding to pursue any legal action, an organization has to evaluate several factors, mainly a cost-benefit analysis for their organization, and then how is it going to impact their business? Maybe financially, but also it could be their reputation, as well as do they have enough evidence and do they have legal standing, which could be a whole podcast in itself. But that is a big part if they have enough evidence to have a strong, successful case.
It sounds like all of these proactive strategies look great on paper, but in my experience, how and when they're implemented is really the key to success. Michealle, as the leader of a small business yourself, you understand the constraints, limited staff, limited resources. Which of these strategies should smaller nonprofits prioritize first?
So smaller organizations really do need to be surgical in their approach because they can't do everything all at once. So I would recommend starting with financial diversification, even if it's modest. So this might mean launching a small individual donor program or developing one earned revenue stream or applying for just a few local foundation grants. The goal isn't to replace the federal funding that's been lost immediately, but to create some buffer that buys the organization some time, if and when their federal funding is disrupted. Political engagement should focus on local relationships rather than trying to influence federal policy directly. All policy flows down and influence has to flow up. And so you think about organizations that are small and really local should build their relationships with their mayors, their county commissioners, their state legislators, and their local business leaders who can then advocate on their behalf. So these relationships are often more accessible for smaller organizations and can be incredibly valuable for immediate crisis response and kind of that long-term sustainability. And then, of course, documentation should focus on stories and testimonials that can be easily shared and understood. Larger organizations can invest in sophisticated data systems and build those, data-informed policy and advocacy arguments, but smaller organizations, they can rely on their stories and their testimonials. It has a significant impact when you've got compelling stories to bring about your work. And the benefit of that is these stories can be used in fundraising, they can be used in advocacy, and they can be used in crisis communications.
Multi-purposing is awesome. What kind of resources currently exist for organizations to implement any of the approaches we've talked about here?
So organizations should start with their existing networks and associations, which often have resources and expertise that maybe individual nonprofits don't have and can't afford to acquire on their own, such as hiring staff, et cetera. So national associations like the National Council of Nonprofits, independent sector and sector-specific associations, so organizations that work with like the homeless population or do affordable housing, they have sector-specific associations that do things like policy monitoring and advocacy training and they have legal resources. So all of these resources already exist. It's just a matter of identifying them and engaging with them. Many state associations of nonprofits offer workshops on financial management, fundraising, advocacy, a whole range of things. So like the North Carolina Center for Nonprofit has a whole nonprofit management institute that it does. The Washington, I'm not going to get the name right, but Washington Nonprofit Association, I think, they are currently also doing similar types of trainings. Again, the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits has a truly excellent policy weekly newsletter that goes out, and you don't have to be in North Carolina to sign up for them. They're all there. So really engaging those resources, understanding what local community foundations are providing. Community foundations often provide training and technical assistance on fundraising and financial sustainability. And then for legal preparedness, organizations should consider joining and forming coalitions like we've talked about that can share legal costs if challenges arise. The legal challenges we've seen around funding freezes and grant terminations have largely been brought by coalitions rather than individual organizations, which really does make them more financially sustainable.
With all of your experience, what mistakes should organizations avoid when they're trying to adapt to this new reality?
So right now I'm seeing organizations making predominantly two relatively dangerous assumptions right now that could hurt their long-term sustainability. The first being that they are assuming that all of this is temporary, that things are going to go back to normal after the next election cycle. But I think that's unlikely because This level of political polarization around federal funding, I don't think is going to go away anytime soon. Both parties have learned that federal grants are a powerful tool for advancing their agendas. And the rescission process, we've talked about, proves that funding decisions can be reversed quickly through partisan processes. Organizations that are sitting tight, waiting for things to get back to how they used to be, really are setting themselves up for failure. I'd say the second mistake I'm seeing frequently, especially from smaller organizations, is thinking that because they have little or no federal funding, none of this affects them. And that really is completely wrong. The ripple effects really are quite significant. So when a large federally funded organization loses their federal funding, they start competing for the same foundation grants, the same corporate sponsorships, the same donor dollars that smaller organizations have typically depended on. So the funding ecosystem, it really doesn't exist in isolation. There's not, federal funding's over here and state is there and private is here. It's all part of one large ecosystem. So when $9 billion gets pulled out of it, that creates competition and scarcity everywhere. So, in addition to that, many organizations don't realize how much they actually depend indirectly on federal funding. So maybe the organization gets grants from a community foundation and the nonprofit doesn't realize that the foundation has received federal pass-through dollars. Or they don't understand that a partner that they have long worked with, excuse me, that is a source of funding for them that ends up being passed through of federal funds. Or that smaller organizations that rely on volunteers may not necessarily understand that those volunteers are actually part of federally funded programs that aren't being funded any longer. So when that infrastructure gets disrupted, it really does affect everyone, even if you don't currently have federal grant dollars. So organizations can't wait for stability to return. They need to build resilience for what I think will be a permanently unstable funding environment. And no organization can assume it's immune just because they don't have direct federal contracts.
Wow, we have discussed a lot of stuff today. And the main message I'm getting is the old days are over and they may never come back. So every nonprofit leader should not be asking themselves if these changes will impact them. They should be figuring out how to prepare. So Michealle, what are the most important takeaways for our listeners and viewers?
So I think, Monette, you're exactly right. I really want to emphasize the urgency of this moment. The convergence of executive branch funding freezes, judicial limitations on protective relief, and congressional rescissions really does represent an unprecedented threat to the nonprofit sector. And we can look at it that way, but we could also look at it as what it is truly, which is a call to action. So organizations that adapt to this new reality will not only survive, but very likely emerge stronger. The organizations that don't adapt are putting their missions, their staff, and their communities really at severe risk. It's not about partisan politics. It's really about organizational resilience in an increasingly volatile political environment. The changes we've documented in the policy brief aren't going away after the next election. They're really not. They represent a fundamental shift in how all three branches of government approach federal funding decisions. And so every nonprofit leader really needs to ask themselves, if our federal funding disappeared tomorrow, could we continue operating? If our work was targeted for political reasons, do we have the relationships and resources to fight back? if we had to rebuild our organization with more diverse funding sources, where would we start? And the organizations that can answer those questions confidently are the ones that will survive in this new environment. The ones that can't really need to start building those capabilities immediately, because the next funding crisis may not give them the luxury of time to prepare.
Thank you, ladies, for a meaningful and compelling conversation about a critical issue facing our nonprofit brothers and sisters out there who depend on federal grant dollars. I'd encourage everyone to visit our Knowledge Hub on our website, where you can download the policy brief, read a blog that is a summary of the policy brief, and gain access to other free workshops, templates, toolkits. Until we see you again, lead fearlessly.